A quiet courthouse hallway, just another ordinary day for most people. But for one teenage girl, it became the place where her voice, her dignity, and her future were put to the test. When a power-hungry officer tried to break her with force, he had no idea who she was or who she was becoming, because Savannah wasn't just another student, she was the calm before the storm. And what happened next wasn't just about one act of injustice, it became a national conversation about truth, identity, and standing your ground in the face of power. So settle in. What you're about to hear is more than just a story, it's a moment that shook a system. Let us know what time you're listening and where you're tuning in from. Drop a comment below, we'd love to hear from you. And if you're ready for a story that doesn't flinch, stay right here. It's time to begin. It was just past 8 a.m. when Savannah Keene stepped out of the car, her canvas sneakers landing softly on the warm pavement outside the Charleston Municipal Courthouse. The morning air carried the quiet hush of a southern spring, cool enough to still feel gentle on the skin, but laced with that familiar scent of azaleas in bloom and distant ocean salt. Savannah adjusted the strap of her tan backpack across one shoulder, her long braids swaying lightly down the back of her navy hoodie. She didn't speak as she walked, just listened to the steady rhythm of her breath, the faint chirp of birds in the trees overhead, and the occasional car passing on the quiet street behind them. Her Aunt Trina walked beside her heels, clicking softly on the concrete, flipping through a folded piece of paper with courthouse instructions printed in bold black ink. They had come to dispute a parking citation, something that should have taken no more than an hour, maybe two if the clerk's line moved slowly. "You sure you got everything?" Trina asked without looking up. Savannah nodded, eyes focused ahead. "Yeah. Citation ID, even the receipt from the meter. Just hope they don't act funny about the date." Trina hummed low in her throat, a sound that said she understood exactly what Savannah meant without needing to explain. They both knew how these places could be quietly tense, a little too watchful, a little too ready to question the wrong person standing in the right place. The courthouse loomed in front of them, nothing grand or marble-lined like in big cities, just a low beige building with narrow windows and a state flag fluttering lazily above the entrance. A security guard in a dark blue uniform held the door open, eyes scanning lazily then sharply as they passed. Savannah offered a quick, polite smile, her eyes dropping just a fraction of a second faster than usual. Inside the building smelled like air conditioning and old paper, the kind of sterile scent that never quite faded no matter how many people passed through. The floors were freshly mopped, and her footsteps echoed faintly as they reached the information desk. Trina led the way, tapping the paper against her palm, her voice measured and professional, as she asked where they needed to go. Savannah, meanwhile, stood slightly behind, scanning the hallway with cautious calm. A few people sat scattered on the benches, an older man flipping through a crossword puzzle, a young mother soothing a restless toddler, and a uniformed officer standing near the water fountain, arms crossed, eyes moving with practiced stillness. Savannah could feel it, an unspoken shift, the way a room subtly tilts when you walk in and someone decides you don't look like you belong. It wasn't anything overt, not yet, but it was there, floating in the corners like invisible dust. Her fingers tightened slightly around the folder in her hands. Not fear, just awareness, a readiness born from experience. She had learned early on from both her father and her own life how to stay calm when the room tries to make you forget who you are. They reached the clerk's window. Savannah stepped forward, slid her documents through the slot, and waited as the woman behind the glass adjusted her glasses and began typing. It was then, just as she turned to say something to her aunt, that she felt it. A gaze. Direct, heavy, not the casual glance of a stranger, but the lingering scrutiny of someone watching too closely. She looked up slowly and saw him, Officer Travis Denham, late 30s tall with a square jaw and a buzz cut, standing near the metal detector, as if it gave him jurisdiction over the air itself. He wasn't doing anything, just staring. But Savannah knew that look. It wasn't curiosity. It was inventory. She held his gaze for a second, then turned back to the counter, without a word, refusing to shrink but not inviting anything either. Her posture was steady, chin high, eyes calm. But inside, her thoughts ticked. Not today. I just came to handle a ticket. That's it. Her body stayed still, but her heart picked up pace. She didn't want her aunt to notice. Trina had dealt with enough over the years. Savannah had promised she wouldn't cause any waves today, not here, not over something so small. But something about the air had changed. Denham didn't move, but neither did his attention. Savannah glanced down at her hands, noticed the tiny quiver in her left thumb, and pressed it gently against the side of the folder. Her breathing slowed, controlled, deliberate. She reminded herself of her training, how to stay centered, how to breathe through someone else's aggression, how not to match the tension that doesn't belong to you. A voice called her name. The clerk was done. Everything in order, just needed a quick signature. Savannah nodded, stepped up, signed with steady fingers, and thanked her with a quiet, "Appreciate it." Then she turned to leave her aunt by her side, her shoulders straight. But she could feel Denham's presence still burning behind her like the sun on a cloudless day. And as they exited the hallway toward the waiting area, Savannah didn't say a word. She didn't need to. The silence said enough that she had seen it coming, that she knew this kind of morning too well, and that something in her gut was whispering this wasn't over yet. Not by a long shot. Savannah didn't notice the shift in the room at first. It came quietly, like a breeze slipping under a door before a storm. The hallway buzzed with ordinary noise, heels tapping a printer, spitting out documents, a distant cough echoing against cinder-block walls. But beneath those sounds was something else. Something you don't hear so much as feel the drop in energy when someone starts watching you, not with curiosity, but calculation. Trina was still reviewing paperwork with the clerk, completely unaware, her voice low, and even like she'd done this a dozen times before. But Savannah's attention had already turned inward, guided by that old familiar instinct, telling her to stay alert without appearing guarded calm, without seeming passive firm, without being accused of attitude. She shifted her weight slightly, eyes scanning the corridor as though she were just passing time, but her gaze inevitably landed on Officer Denham again. He hadn't moved from his post near the metal detector, but now his arms were crossed and his head was tilted just enough to let her know he was looking, and not in a neutral way. There was something in the way his eyes tracked her that wasn't about protocol or safety. It was the look of someone who had already decided who you were, and was just waiting for the chance to confirm it. Savannah felt her breath hitch just once, and forced it back into rhythm. She told herself to stay steady, not because she feared him, but because she knew from her father that men like that didn't respond to fear, they responded to power, and the quiet kind unsettled them most. "I'll wait over there," she murmured to her aunt, nodding toward a bench across the room, keeping her voice even nonchalant. Trina didn't question it, just waved her off with a nod, and kept talking to the clerk. Savannah walked slowly, aware of every step, of how her shoes squeaked ever so slightly on the floor, of how her hoodie sleeves brushed the side of her jeans. She sat down, gently placing the folder on her lap, then crossed one leg over the other, her eyes drifting to the window, as if that's where her thoughts were. But in truth, her thoughts were back on Denham and the creeping discomfort that came with knowing a uniform doesn't always mean protection. It started with the sound of his boots, sharp, steady, deliberate. She heard them before she saw him move, and by the time she glanced up, Denham was halfway across the hallway, walking directly toward her, with the kind of casual entitlement that said he didn't think twice about whether he had a right to do so. Savannah's hands tensed slightly around the folder, but she didn't stand. She didn't flinch. She just watched him approach, her face unreadable, her eyes calm but unblinking. "You waiting for someone?" he asked, voice low but laced with suspicion, the kind that didn't need evidence, only assumption. Savannah met his gaze and nodded. "My aunt. She's at the window." Her tone was respectful but firm, not meek, not aggressive, just enough to be clear. But that only seemed to provoke something in him, like her composure was a challenge rather than a response. "You got business here?" he pressed, taking another step closer. Close enough now that she could smell the faint mix of coffee and starch from his uniform. "Just paperwork," she replied. "A citation." Denham gave a slow nod, eyes scanning her up and down, not in a leering way but in that cold, mechanical way of someone looking for a reason to justify their discomfort. "Got ID on you?" he asked, and Savannah's fingers tightened slightly on her folder. She hesitated for just half a second, not because she didn't have it, but because she knew what came next. She had seen it before, in airports, in department stores, on sidewalks. That strange shift from curiosity to confrontation, where your mere presence becomes a question someone else feels entitled to answer. "It's in the folder," she said, quietly lifting it halfway. "But I don't believe I've done anything that requires—" "Mum," he interrupted. "I'm asking you a simple question. You got ID or not?" The hallway had gone quieter now. A man waiting near the vending machine glanced over. A woman with a toddler paused mid-step. Savannah swallowed hard, not from fear but from the weight of all the stories she carried, not just her own but the women before her who had learned to read the room before the room read them. She nodded once slow. Yes, I have it. But she didn't reach for it yet. She wanted to see if he'd notice, if he'd realize that his question wasn't about procedure, it was about power. Denham didn't. Or maybe he did and just didn't care. He stared for another long second before stepping back only slightly. "Make sure you stay where I can see you," he muttered, almost like a warning disguised as advice. Then he turned and walked off his shoulders, still stiff, his gait slower but no less intentional. Savannah exhaled slowly, the breath she'd been holding sinking down into her chest like a stone. Her hands were damp now. She wiped her palms on her jeans and glanced toward the clerk's window, silently willing her aunt to finish. Her thoughts raced, but her body stayed still. She didn't want to give him another excuse to return. She didn't want to give the hallway another show. But mostly she didn't want to lose control of a moment that was never hers to begin with. And as she sat there, the sunlight filtering through the window catching the edge of her braids, Savannah realized something. The hardest part of being calm wasn't the silence, it was the pressure to carry it gracefully while someone else tried to break it. Savannah had only just returned to her seat near the hallway window when she sensed the tension had followed her like a shadow that didn't know how to stay behind. Her eyes flicked to the side, not obviously, not hurriedly, just enough to confirm what her instincts already told her. Officer Denham hadn't stayed at his post. He was moving again, slow but sure, like a storm cloud deciding where to rain. There was a weight in his steps that didn't match the room's quiet, and the moment she caught his reflection in the narrow glass of the fire extinguisher case, she knew he wasn't coming to ask questions. He was coming to deliver something he believed was owed. Trina was still at the clerk's window. Her attention occupied her body, turned away, unaware of what was now unfolding just 20 feet behind her. Savannah took a breath, let it sit in her chest for a second, longer than normal, then stood up calmly without rush, not because she was afraid, but because she had no intention of being caught seated when that man reached her again. She adjusted the folder under her arm, turned toward the hallway exit, and began walking, not fast, not evasive, just with a quiet sense of purpose. But she hadn't gone 3 steps before she heard it behind her. "Hey, stop right there!" His voice wasn't loud, but it cracked across the hall like a whip. She turned slowly, her expression unreadable, her pulse louder than the air vent above them. Denham's face was set, jaw tight, fingers flexing slightly at his sides like a man trying to decide whether to draw a line or cross it. "I asked you a question earlier," he said, stepping closer, "and you still haven't shown me your ID." Savannah raised an eyebrow just slightly, her voice steady. "I told you it's in the folder, and I haven't done anything wrong. But it was too late for reason." His eyes weren't searching for truth anymore. They were hunting for submission. "That's enough," attitude, he snapped, and before she could take another breath, his hand was on her shoulder, firm and fast, spinning her back toward the wall like she was some kind of threat. Her folder dropped to the floor with a dull slap, papers sliding out and scattering near the baseboard. The hallway froze. Everything around them seemed to stop, every whisper, every footstep, even the air itself, as Denham's hand clamped around Savannah's upper arm, pushing her back until her spine touched painted cinder block. She winced not from pain, but from the humiliating realization that he wanted to make a scene, and she had just become the stage. "I said, show me your ID," he barked again, louder now, enough to draw glances from across the hall. Savannah tried to breathe, but something about the way his body hovered so close stole the room's oxygen. "Let go of me," she said clearly, her voice no longer soft. "You're out of line." Denham's jaw twitched. His grip didn't loosen. "Watch your mouth." That was when she saw the shift, not in him but in the hallway. A courthouse staffer had stopped mid-walk. A young man in a blue shirt was pulling out his phone, fumbling slightly with the camera. Trina's voice finally cut through the air, sharp and alarmed. "Savannah, what's going on?" Savannah tried to answer, but in the split second it took her to turn her head, Denham's hand moved again, this time higher, faster, more forceful than before. Fingers wrapped tight around the base of her neck, pressing hard just below her jawline. The cold, calloused grip of his palm wasn't just an abuse of power, it was a deliberate attempt to erase hers. Time fractured. She couldn't speak. She couldn't breathe. Her hands rose not to fight, but to push, to signal, to plead for basic air. Her vision blurred around the edges, and all she could hear now was the distant roar of blood rushing through her ears. Somewhere, someone shouted. Maybe Trina, maybe a stranger, maybe her own voice trying to escape but failing. And then in the middle of that panic, she remembered something. Something her father told her when she was 12, right after they watched a documentary about civil rights protesters being hosed down in the streets. He had looked at her and said, "The hardest part isn't standing up. It's staying calm when they try to take that away." So she did the only thing she could do. She stopped struggling. She let her hands fall slowly to her sides. She looked Denham square in the eyes, those furious, panicked, desperate for control eyes, and she whispered as clearly as her crushed windpipe would allow, "Call my father." Denham blinked, just once. Confusion passed across his face like a crack in concrete. "What?" Savannah didn't answer. She didn't need to. Because behind her, Trina had already reached for her phone, shouting, "Her father's Stephen Keene! You're about to lose everything!" The name hit the hallway like thunder. The bystander's phone now had a red recording dot flashing in the corner. Another person stepped forward, saying, "Let go of her, she's a kid." But Denham for 1 second longer held on, not because he didn't hear, but because he couldn't believe. And then he released, abruptly, like her skin had burned him. Savannah stumbled forward, coughing once-twice as Trina caught her around the shoulders. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She just stood steadying herself while Denham backed away, pale, now lips parting as if to justify something unjustifiable. The hallway wasn't silent anymore. It was loud with judgment, with gasps and footsteps, with the quick flick of phones going live and faces turning toward the scene they'd just witnessed. Savannah bent down, slowly picked up the scattered documents, smoothed the papers one by one with trembling hands. And when she stood up, straight folder pressed once more against her chest, her voice returned, not loud, not dramatic, but certain. "You put your hands on the wrong girl." She didn't say it for effect. She said it because it was true. And in that moment, in that narrow hallway, bathed in fluorescent light and the uncomfortable weight of too many watching eyes, Savannah Keene didn't just reclaim her space, she claimed the silence too. The hallway had not yet recovered from the sudden rupture of silence when the moment turned from confrontation into something colder, something calculated and violent. Officer Denham hadn't just made a mistake. He had made a decision. A choice born not from fear or misunderstanding, but from something older and uglier, an instinct sharpened by unchecked authority and a belief that control was something he was entitled to enforce with force. Savannah had barely caught her breath when it happened, the weight of his hand once again slamming into her, not against the wall this time, but downward, violently shoving her to the floor, as if her body, her dignity, her voice meant nothing at all. Her knees scraped against the tile with a sharp sting, palms hitting hard as papers scattered again like frightened birds. The pain was real, but it was the humiliation that sank deeper, stinging beneath her skin like frostbite that wouldn't thaw. The air changed. It wasn't just charged, it was alive. Every face in that hallway turned. A gasp somewhere near the clerk's counter. A man's sharp, stunned voice. "What the hell are you doing?" Trina's heels echoed like gunshots as she rushed forward, shouting Savannah's name with the panic of someone who knows too well that it only takes a second for everything to go wrong. Denham was still standing over her, breathing hard, his chest rising and falling beneath his vest, like he had just won something. But there was no victory in his eyes, just the tight, frightened glare of a man who had crossed a line so clearly he couldn't walk it back. Savannah didn't cry. She didn't scream. She sat there on the floor for a moment longer, her chest heaving softly, not because she was afraid, but because she was trying to keep her control from shattering in front of a room full of strangers. Her hands trembled, but she clenched them into fists, willing her body to remain upright, willing her mind to stay focused. She could hear Trina's voice now louder, closer, angry, demanding protective. "Get your hands off her. You assaulted a child, you sick bastard." A clerk ducked behind the counter to call security, while 2 other employees stepped cautiously closer, unsure whether to intervene or document. And then came the moment, the second, where everything began to turn. A young man near the window, maybe in his 20s, lifted his phone high above the crowd thumb, already pressed to the record button. Denham noticed. His gaze flickered. His body stiffened. The badge on his chest, once a symbol of authority, now felt like a weight, pulling him deeper into the mess he created. "She resisted," he said, loudly, eyes darting around for approval he wasn't going to get. "I had to subdue her. She was acting suspicious." But no one moved. No one agreed. The silence after his words was more damning than any outburst could have been. Savannah, still seated on the cold floor, lifted her chin slowly and looked up at him. Her eyes, though rimmed with pain, were steady, burning, not with rage but with clarity. "You think that excuse is going to save you?" she asked, her voice raw but unmistakably calm. "You think a uniform makes that okay?" The phone cameras didn't blink. Trina knelt beside her, whispering, "I'm calling your father. Right now." Savannah nodded faintly, then allowed herself to lean just slightly into her aunt's embrace, not out of weakness, but because she knew the war wasn't over, only paused. Her dignity wasn't broken, just bruised. Behind them, Denham took a step back, then another, trying to steady his posture, as if authority could still be salvaged from the wreckage he had caused. But it was clear in his eyes now, he knew. He knew this wouldn't be buried. He knew that every second of what just happened had been seen, felt, recorded. And he knew her name now, if not before. Savannah Keene. And if not that, then definitely the name her aunt had just shouted into the phone, Stephen Keene. For a beat, no one moved. The hallway seemed to breathe as one, the air tight with tension and unspoken reckoning. Then came the shuffle of more boots. Uniforms approaching from the far end, called in by panicked staff. The responding officers paused as they took in the scene papers on the floor. A teenage girl kneeling beside a furious woman, and Denham standing pale-faced in the center of it all, like a man who just realized the fire he started might burn him down. Trina stood up slowly, facing the new officers with eyes that didn't blink. "You touch her again, and I swear there won't be a badge left in this courthouse." Savannah, too, began to rise, shaky but upright, brushing dust from her palms as she looked around at the people watching. Not one person turned away. Not one person spoke. There was power in that silence. A clerk whispered, "She didn't do anything." A woman in the back added, "That girl never raised her voice." Someone else muttered, "They always go after the quiet ones." And in the center of it all, Savannah finally stood tall again, bruised, shaken, but unbroken. Her eyes scanned the crowd, not for sympathy, but for certainty. She didn't want pity. She wanted the truth acknowledged. And in that moment, she realized something deeper than outrage. This wasn't just about her anymore. This was about every girl who had been told to lower her gaze, to soften her voice, to make herself small enough to survive someone else's fear. She wasn't going to be small anymore. She reached down, gathered her scattered papers again with deliberate care, her fingers sore but steady. When she stood, she adjusted her hoodie, squared her shoulders, and faced the officers who had just arrived. Her voice, when it came, was low but unwavering. "I want his badge number. I want a report. And I want a statement from every witness who saw what he did." The young man with the phone stepped forward. "I got the whole thing on video," he said. "You were calm. He wasn't." Savannah nodded. "Thank you." And then she walked, not hurriedly, not dramatically, just walked like someone who knew where she was going and wasn't asking for permission to get there. The hallway seemed to part for her, not out of fear, but out of respect. Because they all saw it now. They saw the truth, not just in what was done to her, but in how she chose to rise. And as she reached the door at the end of the hall, the morning sun spilling through the glass like a quiet blessing, she turned once, not to look back at Denham, but to look forward into the faces of those who would remember this day. Her face was calm, her hands steady, and her silence. This time wasn't retreat, it was resolve. The hallway was still humming with the aftershocks of what had just unfolded when Savannah leaned gently against the cool, plastered wall, her body exhausted, but her mind sharper than ever. Trina stood beside her, one hand still resting protectively on Savannah's shoulder, the other clutching her phone as if it were a lifeline. The call had already been made. The voice on the other end had been brief, steady, and dangerously calm. "I'm on my way," he'd said, and Trina didn't need to say anything more. He already knew something terrible had happened. Savannah knew it too, not because anyone said it, but because she could feel it radiating off the people around her, the weight of what they had witnessed, settling heavily into their silence. Her legs were shaking slightly, not from fear anymore, but from the effort of holding in everything she refused to let spill out. Her neck ached where Denham's hand had clamped down, and her palms were still red from where she'd caught herself on the floor. But it wasn't the physical pain that lingered, it was the knowing. The knowledge that someone had looked at her, sized her up, and decided she didn't deserve respect or even the benefit of doubt. That knowledge had a texture, a taste, something bitter and metallic that lived in the back of her throat and refused to be swallowed. A deputy from the front desk arrived, breathing harder than the situation required, clipboard in hand, and a nervous look flickering in his eyes. He didn't look at Savannah right away. He looked at Denham, then at the crowd, then finally back at her with something approaching apology, but not quite making it there. "Miss," he began, voice low and uncertain, "I'm going to need a statement from you. This incident needs to be documented." Savannah nodded once slowly, as if the motion itself was deliberate protest against the chaos that had been forced upon her. She stepped forward, her voice quiet but unwavering. "I want it all documented. Every second. Every witness. Every camera in this building." The deputy blinked slightly, startled, then nodded and scribbled something quickly on his form. Behind them, Denham stood to the side, hands now loosely at his waist, mouth pressed into a flat line as though he were still trying to process how quickly things had slipped out of his control. He wasn't in handcuffs yet, but the air around him had shifted, and he seemed to know his uniform didn't grant him the shield it used to. More courthouse staff began gathering near the entrance, whispering in tight clusters, eyes darting between Savannah the deputy and the crowd of bystanders still glued to their spots. The silence wasn't empty, it was watchful. It was waiting. And in the middle of it, Savannah turned toward Trina and asked softly, "How long do you think it'll take him to get here?" Trina glanced at the phone again, then at the courthouse doors. 15 minutes, she said, her voice steady. Maybe less. Savannah exhaled, closed her eyes briefly, and let the tension roll off her shoulders just enough to stay standing. She wasn't angry in the way people often expect, not loud, not chaotic, not consumed by rage. Her anger had a shape, a center, a calmness that came from knowing exactly who she was and refusing to let someone else rewrite it. She had grown up watching her father walk into rooms where people doubted him on sight and walk out with their respect, not because he demanded it, but because he carried himself like someone who didn't need permission to be powerful. And in this moment, she understood what he had meant when he said, "Dignity isn't how you avoid being broken. It's how you rebuild after someone tries." A few more minutes passed before the sound of tires rolling across the front lot reached her ears, followed by the sudden shift of energy that always happens when someone important enters a space, not out of ceremony, but out of consequence. The glass door opened and there he was, Stephen Keene. No security detail, no entourage, just a tall man in a plain black coat, boots that made no noise on the tile, and eyes that scanned the room with the focused precision of someone who had walked through too many war zones, physical or otherwise, to be surprised by this kind of battlefield. He didn't rush to her. He didn't speak at first. He just walked slow and silent toward his daughter, the hallway parting, without a word. Savannah looked up when she felt his presence beside her, and for a moment she said nothing either. She didn't need to. He reached out gently, took her hand in his, and gave it a squeeze, just enough pressure to say, "I see you. I believe you. I'm here." Then his gaze shifted, sweeping across the room until it landed squarely on Denham. The look wasn't angry. It wasn't aggressive. It was colder than that, disappointed, unyielding, the kind of look that made men rethink their decisions before trying to defend them. Denham opened his mouth, perhaps to explain or protest, but Stephen raised one hand, palm open, and said quietly, "Don't," and that was enough. The room fell still again. The deputy who'd been collecting statements stepped forward and asked if Mr. Keene wished to speak with administration, and Stephen nodded without looking away. "I'll be filing federal charges," he said plainly, "and we'll be speaking with internal affairs." It wasn't a threat. It was a statement of fact. Savannah finally sat down again, letting her body relax into the bench, her hands still resting in her father's paras. She watched the crowd disperse slowly, like people leaving a theater after a performance too heavy to talk about yet. Trina sat beside her, rubbing her back gently, and the deputy stepped away to take the first witness report. The hallway returned to its usual sounds. The printer buzzed again, someone coughed near the clerk's desk. A child's voice echoed faintly from the stairwell. But something had changed. Not just in Savannah, but in the air itself. It was no longer a place where anything could happen to anyone without question. Now it was a place where someone had stood calmly and completely against something meant to silence her. And as she leaned back against the cool stone wall once more, eyes half closed, breath steady, Savannah Keene realized something simple and final. This was not the end of what happened to her, but it was the end of pretending it didn't matter. It started with a single video clip, shaky and grainy, taken from a smartphone held by a young man whose hands were trembling not from fear but from disbelief at what he was witnessing in a courthouse hallway on a Wednesday morning. The footage was less than 40 seconds long, but it contained everything. Savannah being pinned to the wall, her voice calm but strained. Denham's hand pressed against her neck, the dropped folder, the crowd frozen in horrified silence, and then that clear, measured sentence that seemed to cut through the entire moment like a blade through fog. "Call my father." There was no rage in her voice, no panic, just a quiet assertion of presence that turned the energy in that room upside down. By the time Savannah and her father had exited the courthouse and left the scene behind, the video had already been shared over 100,000 times. People didn't know who she was yet, but they knew what they saw. They knew that what was done to her was wrong. They knew that no teenager, no young woman of any color should be treated that way by someone in uniform, especially not inside a public building under fluorescent lights in front of witnesses who said nothing until it was already over. Within 3 hours, local news had picked up the story, reposting the video with a blurred face and a vague headline, "Tense moment between officer and teen girl at county courthouse." But the internet doesn't do vague for long. Within minutes, someone recognized Savannah, then someone else. Then came the avalanche, not just of shares and likes, but of context screenshots from her public school speech, contest clips of her father from old interviews, even a photo from her birthday 2 months earlier, standing in front of a cake that said, "To the next generation." That detail hit hardest. The next generation. And here she was, being choked by the last one's failure. By sunset, the video had gone national. News anchors spoke her name with forced solemnity. Civil rights attorneys called for Denham's suspension. Social media split along the usual fault lines. Some demanded justice, others made excuses. But in the center of the storm stood a girl who hadn't asked for any of it. Savannah had spent the rest of her afternoon not scrolling through reactions, not giving interviews, not even speaking much at all. She sat at the edge of her bed in a quiet room, the blinds half closed, her phone turned face down on the nightstand. She felt the storm brewing outside, not just in the news but in the world itself, people's outrage rising in her name, though few knew the quiet weight of the hours she'd endured after the fact. The slow return of sensation in her fingers. The way her voice cracked when she tried to speak for too long. The headache behind her eyes that hadn't left since Denham's hand left her throat. And mostly the question looping silently in her mind. What if no one had recorded it? That thought haunted her more than the assault itself. Because she knew the truth. If there hadn't been footage, if there hadn't been that one kid with enough courage to lift his phone and press record, she might have walked out of that building as just another quiet girl with bruises and no story anyone believed. The video had protected her dignity, but it had also taken her privacy. It had given her justice, but it had also made her public. And somewhere in the middle of all that, Savannah felt the beginning of something she didn't yet have words for. Her father sat on the other side of the room, quietly typing on a laptop, the soft clicks of the keyboard barely audible over the low hum of the air conditioning. He hadn't said much either. They had exchanged only a few sentences since returning home. Short phrases, practical questions, gentle reassurances, but the real conversation was still waiting. It sat between them like a closed door, neither of them quite ready to open it. Finally, as the last light of day slipped behind the window pane and the room fell into that soft blue quiet that comes before night, Savannah spoke. "I didn't want to go viral," she said, her voice low. "I just wanted to be left alone." Her father paused, then looked up. "I know," he said, "and you should have been." There was a long silence after that. Not heavy, not uncomfortable, just honest. He closed the laptop, slowly stood up and walked over to where she sat. Then, without a speech or a lecture, he placed his hand gently on her shoulder and sat down beside her. Not as an actor, not as a public figure, but as a father who had once faced cameras too, and knew the strange violence of being turned into a symbol when all you wanted was to be seen as human. "They know who you are now," he said, "but more importantly, you know who you are. Don't let them take that." Savannah nodded the corner of her mouth, lifting just slightly, not in a smile, but in something quieter, acceptance maybe, or the first breath of something close to peace. Outside, the wind rustled through the trees, and the world kept moving faster than either of them could catch. But inside that room there was stillness. Not weakness, not defeat, just stillness. And in that stillness, a girl sat beside her father and realized something small but unshakable. The world may not have asked for her story, but now that it had it, she would make sure it meant something. Stephen Keen didn't sleep the night after the incident, at least not in any way that could be called rest. He'd lain on the worn leather couch in his home office, arms crossed over his chest, eyes fixed on the ceiling fan as it turned in slow mechanical circles. The house was quiet, save for the occasional creak of wood settling or the muted click of his daughter's bedroom door, as she got up once to use the bathroom and once more just to check if he was still there. He hadn't moved. He wanted her to see he wasn't going anywhere. He wanted her to feel his presence even if neither of them had the energy to keep speaking. When dawn finally broke through the blinds in long gold streaks, Stephen rose without ceremony, boiled water for tea the way his mother had taught him when he was 10, and stood in the kitchen holding the warm mug in both hands as if he were trying to keep himself from coming apart. The news was everywhere by then. Savannah's face blurred on some channels, not on others. Her name paired with words like assaulted, targeted daughter of actor, and caught on video. None of them knew who she really was. They knew the moment. But they didn't know the girl behind the footage, the stubborn, soft-spoken teenager who loved bad poetry and old jazz records, and who, up until yesterday, thought the courthouse was just another building grown-ups had to deal with. He knew he had to act not for the cameras, not for the public, but for her. Because he had seen the look in her eyes when she came home, the quiet calculation of someone taking inventory of a world that had just shifted beneath her feet. Not broken, no, but altered. Her gaze didn't ask for pity or protection. It asked for response. And Stephen, who had spent half a lifetime playing characters with power, knew when it was time to stop pretending and finally use his own. He made a few calls before noon. 2 lawyers he trusted, one civil rights advocate in D.C. and a quiet but relentless journalist in Atlanta who owed him a favor from years back. He wasn't trying to start a media war, not yet. He was building a foundation beneath his daughter's feet, one brick at a time, so she wouldn't have to stand alone. That afternoon, he dressed not in a tailored suit or the neutral blacks of public relations mode, but in jeans and a dark button-down shirt, the kind of outfit that said he wasn't here to charm anyone, he was here to speak plainly. When he stepped into the press briefing room, set up hastily outside their home, he didn't carry notes or wait for silence. He spoke the way a father speaks when the world has wronged his child. Calm, slow, every word wrapped in gravity. "My daughter," he began, "was assaulted by a police officer in a government building while doing nothing more than complying with instructions. She didn't yell. She didn't resist. She didn't threaten. She simply existed in a space where someone didn't believe she belonged." The reporters listened, some with pens frozen above notepads, others watching through viewfinders, trying to frame the image without losing the sound. "Let me be clear," he continued. "This isn't just about her being my daughter. This is about your daughters, your sons, your nieces and nephews, and the young people you send into public spaces every day with the blind hope they'll be treated like human beings." He didn't mention Denham's name. He didn't need to. It was already trending, already dissected. Instead, he focused on what came next. Formal complaints filed, federal review, requested, civil charges pending. But more than that, he spoke about the moment, the one frozen in the video, the one where his daughter looked directly into the eyes of the man harming her and refused to shrink. "She said, 'Call my father,'" Stephen said, pausing only briefly. "She didn't say it to be dramatic. She said it because she knew who she was." That line hit different. Not just with the press, but with the people watching from home, from classrooms, from church basements and hospital break rooms. People who didn't know Savannah, but recognized something sacred in the act of a young girl claiming her place when someone tried to erase it. Back inside, Savannah hadn't watched the speech live. She was sitting by the back window, headphones in, listening to an instrumental playlist that had no lyrics, just piano and the occasional soft violin swell. She didn't need to hear her father defend her. She already knew he would. What she needed was silence, not the kind that felt like absence, but the kind that made space for breath. When he returned, he didn't say a word. He walked into the kitchen, opened the cabinet for another mug, and poured them both a cup of tea. She joined him wordless, and they stood side by side, not as father and child or public figure and symbol, but as two people weathering the same storm. She finally broke the silence. "It still feels like it didn't really happen," she whispered, barely louder than the kettle's fading hiss. Stephen nodded. "I know," he said. "That's how trauma works. It makes you question the truth even when you lived it." Savannah exhaled slowly, letting the steam from her cup rise into her face. "But I remember everything. His face, his hands, the way nobody said anything until it was already happening." "You said something," Stephen replied. And the world heard you. That moment wasn't loud, but it was powerful. Because beneath all the media noise and headlines and interviews, what mattered most was that she had spoken not to them, not to the crowd, but to herself. She had named her truth out loud. And sometimes that's the beginning of everything. Outside, the sun began to set, casting long amber shadows across the hardwood floor. The tea had gone lukewarm. The house remained quiet. But between the two of them there was something stronger than silence now. There was understanding. And it held. The courthouse that once held nothing more than dull administrative weight had become the center of a slow-burning reckoning, and Savannah could feel its eyes on her even when the building was empty. 2 days had passed since her name became national news, and the echo of the moment, the one caught on camera, replayed on every news cycle, captioned and dissected and politicized, had only grown louder. But beneath the headlines, in rooms where decisions were made without cameras or fanfare, something quieter was beginning to take shape. It wasn't just a backlash. It was the start of an unraveling, and Savannah could sense it even as she sat on the courthouse steps, watching the morning sun climb higher over the town's modest skyline. The crowd that had gathered out front wasn't loud or angry. There were no chants, no raised fists, just people standing shoulder to shoulder, their silence heavier than any slogan. Some carried handmade signs with phrases scribbled in bold marker, "Protect our daughters, justice is accountability, we see you, Savannah." Others just came to watch, unsure of what to say, but unwilling to say nothing at all. There were mothers pushing strollers, veterans in worn jackets, students from the local college, and retirees leaning on canes and walkers, all drawn by the same gravity, the same question they couldn't shake. How did this happen in our town? Inside, the sheriff's office was holding an emergency meeting with the county legal board, and Savannah's father had been invited to attend, not as a celebrity, not even as a parent, but as a man now standing between a system and its crumbling illusion of neutrality. He had walked into the meeting, calm, his voice low but unwavering, stating facts without flourish, naming names without hesitation. The sheriff had tried to control the narrative, mentioning procedure and protocol, but Stephen had interrupted only once, saying, "If a badge gives you the power to choke a girl, and then claim paperwork justifies it, your system isn't broken, it's working exactly as it was built." No one in the room spoke after that for a long time. Back outside, Savannah leaned forward slightly, resting her elbows on her knees, watching as a reporter scribbled notes a few feet away. She hadn't agreed to an interview today. She was just there, grounded in her presence, giving people something real to stand behind. Trina sat beside her, one hand on her back, the other holding a thermos of lukewarm tea that neither of them had touched. The air was warm, thick, with late spring humidity, and yet a slow chill crawled along Savannah's spine each time someone new walked up to the steps and paused, unsure of whether to speak or just offer a nod of solidarity. She didn't need them to say anything. Their being there was enough. But still, one woman, mid-60s, stepped forward after a long moment of hesitation and knelt beside her eyes, wet voice barely above a whisper. "You reminded me of my granddaughter. What you did, how you stood there, you gave her something to believe in." Savannah looked at her, blinking slowly, not quite trusting her voice yet, and simply said, "Thank you." And that was enough. The woman stood, nodded once, and returned to the crowd. What Savannah felt in that moment wasn't pride. It wasn't even strength. It was weight, the realization that her story had grown legs of its own and was now walking into homes, classrooms, kitchens, and hearts she would never see. And with that weight came responsibility, not to carry the movement on her back, but to remain centered in truth, to protect her own peace as the noise grew louder around her. Later that afternoon, the press conference came quickly, announced less than an hour in advance, and held on the very courthouse steps where Savannah had been sitting. The mayor stood beside the sheriff, both of them flanked by city attorneys and 2 carefully positioned public relations staffers. The podium looked too small, the microphones too many, and the words too late. When the sheriff finally spoke, his voice was practiced but brittle, as though held together by threads of fear and legal strategy. He said the department had opened an internal investigation, that Officer Denham had been placed on administrative leave pending review, and that the county would fully cooperate with any inquiries. But no one clapped, no one cheered, because what had happened wasn't just a violation of protocol, it was a betrayal of something deeper. A girl had walked into a courthouse to settle a parking citation and walked out a national headline, not because of anything she did, but because someone looked at her and saw threat where there was none. And now the system was scrambling not because it wanted justice, but because it had been seen. Savannah watched the press conference from a distance, her arms folded across her chest, her face unreadable. Her father stood beside her, hands in his pockets, gaze steady. When the sheriff stepped down and the reporters swarmed forward with questions, neither of them moved. They didn't need to. The truth had already been spoken, and anything said now was just an attempt to catch up to a moment that had already passed them by. As the crowd began to disperse, a breeze picked up across the lawn, rustling papers and signposts, and carrying with it the quiet murmur of conversations too honest for microphones. Savannah turned toward her father and said softly, "They're not used to being watched." He nodded once, then replied, "They will be now." And with that she exhaled deeply for the first time all day, the kind of breath that settles into the body not with relief but with readiness. Not because everything had changed, but because she had. And change, like that quiet, steady, unshaken, moves through the world in ways no one sees coming until it's already there. The conference room inside the federal building wasn't designed for emotion. It was built for neutrality, for procedures, for measured voices and polished wood, for fluorescent lights that erased shadows and made everything feel just a little colder than it needed to be. Savannah sat at the far end of a long rectangular table, hands resting in her lap, spine, straight posture, calm, though the tension in her neck hadn't fully let go since the moment she entered. Across from her sat two representatives from the Department of Justice, one woman and one man, both dressed in muted gray suits with identical pens and legal pads in front of them. To their left was a civil rights attorney from D.C., who had flown in that morning. To their right, a representative from the governor's office, silent, unreadable, shifting occasionally in her seat like she wanted to speak but knew better. The air was still the kind of stillness that doesn't happen naturally, but is forced into a room by the weight of what's being discussed. Stephen Keene sat beside his daughter, close enough to let her feel his presence, but far enough to let her lead. That was the agreement from the start. This would be her voice, not his, her experience not filtered through anyone else's lens, not even her father's. Savannah hadn't spoken yet. They were still setting up, flipping pages, checking sound levels for the transcript recorder. She took a sip from the glass of water they'd placed in front of her, her hands steady, her breath controlled, her silence, not born from fear, but from the understanding that when she spoke, she would not be interrupted. When they finally asked her to begin, she didn't look down at any notes. She didn't ask for a pause. She simply exhaled, then started speaking like someone who had waited her whole life for a room to actually listen. Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried across the table, across the room, across every line of doubt or discomfort. "I walked into that courthouse to correct a ticket," she said, "not to become a target. I stood in a hallway, silent, compliant, present. And that was enough for someone to decide I was a threat." She told them everything, not just what happened, but how it felt. The moment the officer's grip tightened, the sound of paper hitting the floor, the way her legs bent without permission. She described how time slowed and then collapsed, how she felt the crowd watching and yet not moving, not intervening, not seeing her as someone worth protecting until the moment had already passed. One of the officials leaned forward slightly, not to interrupt, but because something in the way she described it was different from what they'd read in the report. This wasn't an event she was reciting. It was a moment she was still carrying. She didn't dramatize it. She didn't need to. Her words were simple, deliberate, and layered with the kind of clarity that only comes from living through something and surviving it without bitterness. "I knew he saw me before he touched me," she said, "not for who I was, but for who he decided I must be." There was a pause, then, not because she was unsure, but because the room needed it. Even the pens stopped moving for a moment. Savannah's fingers brushed lightly against her thigh, grounding herself, then continued. "When I said, 'Call my father,' I wasn't invoking celebrity. I was naming my lifeline. I was reminding him and myself that I wasn't invisible." Her father remained still, not even nodding, not even shifting in his chair. He was silent, not because he had nothing to add, but because he knew no one else could speak that truth but her. She went on to describe the aftermath, how it felt to have her face go viral, how strangers now carried her story like it was theirs, how she watched news anchors debate her dignity as if it were a concept instead of a fact. She didn't cry. Her voice didn't crack. But her eyes, those wide, focused eyes, held everything they needed to say. When she finished, the room stayed quiet for a moment longer than it needed to. The woman across the table finally spoke, her voice low, measured. "Savannah, I want to thank you for your testimony. This is important." Savannah nodded, then leaned back in her chair slightly, her body loosening for the first time in over an hour. The weight hadn't lifted, but it had shifted, redistributed, shared if only a little. Outside, the city buzzed with its usual rhythm. Cars, construction, crosswalks, blinking red to white and back again. Inside that room, though, something had changed. It wasn't legislative yet. It wasn't even procedural. But it was real. It was the start of accountability, not as a punishment, but as recognition of harm, of truth, of voice. On their way out of the building, Stephen placed his hand gently on his daughter's shoulder and said nothing. He didn't have to. She could feel what he was saying just through the way he exhaled as they reached the steps. There was no crowd waiting this time. No cameras, no reporters, just the two of them standing in sunlight. And as they walked together toward the car, Savannah reached into her pocket, pulled out the folded paper. She hadn't shown anyone, yet a short draft of a letter she planned to send to the Department of Education, calling for emotional trauma training in student rights seminars, written not from anger but from experience. She unfolded it quietly, rereading the first sentence to herself. "Sometimes the worst thing they take from you isn't breath, it's the belief that anyone will care once it's over." She folded it again, tucked it back into her jacket, and looked up toward the horizon, not for a sign, not for an answer, but because she knew where she was headed next. And this time no one would define that path but her. The courtroom was quiet, so quiet that even the faint click of a pen cap sounded like a warning. Savannah stood near the side wall, her eyes scanning the room, not for familiarity, but for control, for clarity, for proof that she still had something solid beneath her feet after everything that had been done to take it from her. She wasn't here today as a victim or a symbol. She was here because the man who had hurt her was finally being asked to answer for it. Not to her alone, but to a system that for the first time in a very long time was being forced to look at itself in the mirror. Across the room, Officer Travis Denham sat in a straight-backed wooden chair, no longer in uniform, no badge on his chest, no gun at his hip, just a gray button-down shirt, and eyes that looked smaller than she remembered. His posture had changed, not defeated exactly, but diminished, like a man who hadn't yet decided whether to fight or surrender and wasn't quite sure how to do either with grace. The judge, an older man with a kind but unreadable face, flipped through several pages before lifting his eyes toward the room. "We are here today not to debate perception, but to examine action," he said. "The court is not blind to context. It is not deaf to consequence. But its duty is to remain clear-eyed about fact." Savannah's heart beat slow and steady. She had practiced that rhythm, not in therapy, not in a gym, but in long hours of silence at home, listening to her own breath and learning to control what could be controlled. When her name was called to the stand, she didn't hesitate. She walked forward with the calm of someone who no longer feared being looked at because she had already survived being seen the wrong way. The chair creaked slightly as she sat. Her hands rested gently on her knees. She didn't look at Denham, not out of fear, but because she had already moved past him. Her focus was on the truth now, and the space it took up when spoken out loud. The prosecutor approached slowly, not wanting to crowd her. "Ms. Keene, I know you've shared your statement before, but for the record today, I'd like to ask, what were you thinking in the exact moment the officer placed his hands around your throat?" Savannah didn't flinch. She didn't rush. She paused just long enough to feel the question settle into her ribs, then replied, "I thought I had done everything right, and it still wasn't enough to keep me safe." Her voice didn't shake. It didn't soar. It just sat in the room like a stone in water spreading outward in ripples. The prosecutor nodded, then took a few steps to the side. "And did you say anything to the officer at that time?" She nodded slightly. "I said, 'Call my father.' And why those words?" She looked at the floor for a second, then back up. "Because I needed him to remember I was someone, that I wasn't a threat, that I had someone who would come for me, and maybe if he knew who my father was, he'd stop." Silence filled the room, not uncomfortable, not tense, but heavy with understanding. Her words weren't for pity. They were evidence. Each sentence another frame in a larger picture of what had really happened that day. Later, as the defense took its turn, Denham's lawyer tried to soften the blow, to pivot to training and fatigue and perception. He spoke about body language, miscommunication, pressure under stress, and the fear officers feel every day in uncertain situations. Savannah listened without interrupting. She knew what they were trying to do, reshape the story into something abstract, something technical, something that could be sanitized with policy. But her truth wasn't theoretical. It had happened in front of real people on real ground, and had left behind real bruises. When the closing statements ended, and the judge called for a brief recess before announcing the ruling, Savannah stepped outside. The hallway smelled of varnished wood and institutional coffee, the kind that's been burned by too many hours on a hot plate. She leaned against the far wall, eyes closed, her father beside her, silent as ever, present as always. After a long pause, he finally spoke. "No matter what happens in there, you did what you came to do." She nodded slowly. "I just want the truth to count for something." And maybe that was what made her different. She wasn't here for revenge. She wasn't here for headlines. She was here to make sure that what happened to her didn't disappear into the long list of unspoken things people only whisper about in private. When they were called back in, the room had filled again. Journalists, observers, even a few community members who hadn't known her before but felt the gravity of what her story had opened up in the town. The judge returned to his bench, glasses low on his nose, the weight of the decision already visible in his slow, deliberate posture. In the matter of Officer Travis Denham versus the state, he began. This court finds the actions taken to be excessive, unjustified, and in violation of both legal protocol and human decency. He paused, letting the words settle. Mr. Denham will be stripped of his certification, placed on the state's misconduct registry, and referred for civil review under federal oversight. There was no cheering, no gasps. Just the soft sound of chairs shifting, and one quiet exhale from Savannah's lips. Justice for once had come not with thunder but with clarity. She didn't smile. She didn't cry. She just sat there, eyes open, heart steady, knowing that this wasn't the end of the work, but it was an end to something. A moment, a chapter, a wound. And as the judge stood and walked off the bench, as Denham was escorted quietly out a side door, Savannah Keene remained seated, not because she needed to gather herself, but because she was already whole. The interview room at the news station wasn't intimidating in the way courtrooms or official chambers could be. It was bright, modern, almost disarming, with soft gray walls, warm LED lighting, and a faint scent of fresh coffee drifting in from the green room down the hall. But for Savannah, the silence between questions felt heavier than anything she'd experienced in a courtroom. She sat on the edge of a sleek white chair, one leg crossed neatly over the other, her hands resting lightly in her lap, fingers laced together, not from nervousness but from the effort it took to keep her focus tight and her energy grounded. The cameras weren't rolling yet, but the crew moved like dancers who'd done this routine 1,000 times, checking mics, adjusting angles, nodding toward producers behind panes of tinted glass. She didn't ask how long it would be before they started, because time no longer moved in neat intervals for her. Not since the hallway, not since the pressure on her throat, not since her voice became public property. The producer, a kind woman in her 40s with kind eyes and a clipboard covered in red scribbles, leaned in and whispered, "We'll keep it conversational, no pressure, just speak your truth." Savannah nodded softly, and beneath that calm expression was a current of quiet steel. She wasn't here for sympathy or sound bites. She was here because people had started listening, and if they were listening, then they deserved to hear it directly from her. The host sat across from her, a polished, composed man with a clean-cut suit, a practiced smile, and eyes that occasionally flicked down to his cue cards between pleasantries. But when the countdown ended and the red light on the camera blinked to life, something in his expression shifted, not because he was nervous, but because he knew this story had weight, and stories with weight change the way we carry ourselves. Savannah didn't hesitate when the first question came, though it was the kind that usually made people pause. "How have you changed since that day?" the host asked, voice gentle but direct. She sat a little straighter, not to present herself, but to make sure she owned the space she was speaking from. "I don't think I've changed," she said. "I think I've just become more visible to them, to myself, to the world." She let the silence after that sentence sit. It wasn't filler, it was substance. They didn't see me before, she continued, even when I was standing right in front of them, even when I was doing everything right. But now they have no choice. The host nodded, his eyes steady. "Do you think being the daughter of someone famous changed how people responded afterward?" She gave a soft half-smile. It changed how quickly they responded, maybe. But not what they saw. That part, the part where someone still looked at me and only saw threat that had nothing to do with my last name. She didn't flinch when she said it. She didn't try to soften it. She just told the truth plain and grounded. The next few questions moved through timelines and reactions, the public's outrage, the media cycles, the legal steps that followed. But what caught the room, what stilled even the crew behind the glass, was when she spoke not about the moment but about the hours that came after. "It's not just the violence you remember," she said, voice low and certain. "It's the silence that follows it. The way people look at you like you survived something big but don't want to ask what that survival cost." She paused, then added, "It cost my peace. Not all of it, but the quiet, easy kind. The kind where you walk into a room and don't have to scan for exits. I don't know if I'll ever get that kind back." There was no dramatic music, no cut to commercial, just stillness, respect. The kind of stillness that says a room understands it's in the presence of something sacred, truth stripped bare of pretense. When the segment wrapped and the host leaned over to thank her, off-mic Savannah reached for her water, but didn't stand up right away. She needed a moment to gather herself, not because she had broken down, but because speaking truth takes something from you, even when it's healing, even when it's necessary. Back in the hallway, walking slowly toward the exit with her father a step behind, she passed a junior staffer, maybe 23, maybe still in college, who caught her gaze for just a second, longer than politeness allowed. The girl offered a quiet thank you, barely above a whisper, but full of something real. Savannah smiled, not a media smile, but a human one. Outside, the late afternoon sun slanted between buildings, painting the sidewalk in amber streaks and shadows. Traffic hummed in the distance, someone laughed loudly from a nearby cafe, and the world in its usual rush moved on. But for Savannah, standing there just beyond the automatic doors, something in her body felt still again, not like the silence of trauma, but like the stillness that comes after a storm, when you've done everything you could, and the sky has finally begun to clear. She looked up for a long moment, not searching for signs or symbols, but letting herself feel the warmth of the sun, the space of the sky, the simple proof that she was still here. Not because of what happened, not because of the cameras or the headlines, but because she had made a choice to speak, and speaking had not broken her. It had shaped her. Not into a symbol, not into a figurehead, but into something both softer and stronger than before. And as her father unlocked the car as they stepped inside, and the doors closed behind them, she glanced once more at her reflection in the window. Her own eyes, looking back, unflinching, clear and quietly, certain of one thing. She didn't just survive the story. She became the one who would finish it on her own term. The first time Savannah walked back into the courthouse after the ruling, she didn't go through the front doors or speak to a crowd. She entered quietly through the side entrance reserved for staff and attorneys, escorted by a member of the building's security team, who recognized her immediately, but said nothing more than "Morning, Miss Keene," with a soft nod. The hallways looked the same, beige walls, cold floors, fluorescent lights buzzing with their familiar hum, but they didn't feel the same. Something had shifted, not in the structure, but in the way the space now carried her memory. The place where she had once been humiliated was now the place she had stood her ground, and while that didn't erase the pain, it had left something else in its wake, a strange sort of quiet power. She was there to meet with the new Community Liaison Committee, a panel recently formed in the aftermath of the trial tasked with reviewing courthouse procedures and improving accountability. The board consisted of retired judges, civic leaders, trauma-informed educators, and by special appointment Savannah herself. When they'd asked her to join, she hadn't answered right away. She'd taken a week to think, to breathe, to ask herself whether she wanted to be inside the system that had once refused to see her. But in the end, she said yes, not out of obligation, but out of clarity. She wasn't there to reform from the inside. She was there to remind the inside that it no longer existed without her. The meeting was held in a conference room on the third floor. Glass walls, clean lines, a long oval table that reflected the morning light from the eastern-facing windows. Savannah arrived early, not because she was nervous, but because she needed a moment alone in the space before the dialogue began. She stood at the window, looking out across the city. She knew so well where the rooftops were uneven, and the skyline interrupted by trees, church steeples, and the occasional crane. It was a place of contradictions, beauty and bureaucracy, hospitality and harm, and she had learned in her own skin how those things could exist side by side, without apology. When the others arrived, she greeted each of them with the same measured grace, polite, calm, open, but never deferential. A few of them were old enough to remember her father's earliest films. One even remarked with a chuckle, "You've got his quiet eyes, but your own fire." Savannah smiled, not because of the compliment, but because she liked the idea of holding both stillness and flame presence and resistance. The meeting began with policy language, proposed procedural changes, and ideas for community outreach. There were discussions about signage training modules, language access, and security personnel evaluations. Savannah listened, took notes, occasionally nodded, but said little. She waited. Not because she didn't have thoughts, but because she had learned that silence, when timed right, could become a kind of authority. It wasn't until someone suggested a 2-year review cycle that she leaned forward slightly, eyes focused, voice low but clear. "If it takes 2 years to fix what was done in 2 minutes," she said, "we haven't learned anything." The room fell quiet, not out of offense but respect. She wasn't grandstanding. She was pointing to something everyone in the room had felt but hadn't named: the urgency of now, the responsibility of the moment. Later, after the meeting adjourned, 2 board members approached her privately, an older woman with kind eyes, and a younger man who looked like he was still figuring out what allyship meant. "You don't have to do all of this, you know," the woman said gently. "You've already done more than enough." Savannah met her gaze evenly. "I'm not doing it because I have to. I'm doing it because I'm here. And I want the next girl to walk through that hallway and feel something different." Outside, the light had shifted. Late afternoon now. The shadows grew longer along the sidewalk, and the air smelled faintly of warm pavement and magnolia. Savannah walked out of the courthouse alone. No cameras, no reporters, no crowd. Just her notebook, and the sound of footsteps echoing softly behind her as the door swung closed. She paused at the bottom of the steps, looking out across the small plaza, where weeks earlier protest signs had covered every inch of grass and concrete. Now it was clean, quiet, almost ordinary, but she remembered. Not just the fear and pain, but the people who stood there in solidarity, who brought folding chairs and water bottles and speakers that hummed with gospel, music, and hope. Her phone buzzed gently in her jacket pocket, a text from her father. "Proud of you. Dinner." She smiled, typed back. "On my way," and began the short walk toward the parking lot. The rhythm of her steps matched the rhythm of her breath. Not rushed, not cautious, just steady. And as she walked, she passed a young girl sitting with her mother on a nearby bench. The child looked up, recognized her, and offered a quiet wave. Savannah returned it with a nod, and the smallest, most sincere smile she'd given all day. Not because she needed to be seen, but because she wanted that little girl to know you can be hurt, you can be changed, and still come back into the same spaces with your head held high. She reached her car keys in hand, the engine humming softly as it came to life. Before pulling away, she sat for a moment in the driver's seat, watching the courthouse fade into the rearview mirror, not as a threat anymore, but as a place where history had bent just slightly toward justice. And in that stillness, as the sky began to shift from gold to gray, she allowed herself one quiet thought, not of revenge, not of righteousness, but of peace. Let it begin with me. Savannah had always thought of community as something quiet, something you slipped into through shared sidewalks and polite nods, grocery store, greetings, familiar faces at the library, the barista who remembered your order before you said a word. But lately that idea had grown teeth. It had stopped being soft and started feeling more like weight, like something you carried with you into every room, into every conversation, even when you didn't ask for it. Since the day her story went public, Savannah hadn't walked through a single space in town without someone stopping, staring, or saying they were proud of her, sometimes with sincerity, sometimes with discomfort, and sometimes with a sort of reverent awe that made her want to disappear. But she didn't disappear. She stayed. She walked those same streets, answered the questions people didn't know how to ask, and met the eyes of strangers who still hadn't decided whether she was a hero, a victim, or just a girl who got lucky. Someone filmed it. And in doing so, she realized something: accountability wasn't just about the officer who hurt her. It was about the silence that had allowed him to feel untouchable. It was about the people who watched it happen, not just that day but all the days before, and said nothing because they didn't know how or didn't think it was their place. That was why she'd agreed to speak at the Civic Center, an old theater-turned-meeting hall near the middle of town, with creaky floors, heavy curtains, and rows of folding chairs that seemed to multiply the closer you got to showtime. When she walked in through the side door that afternoon, the place was already humming with the energy of arrival shoes, scuffling against concrete clipboards, being checked, someone adjusting a mic stand with a high-pitched squeal that made everyone wince. The event was part of a new city-led initiative focused on rebuilding public trust forums, workshops, panels, and they'd asked Savannah to open the series, not with a speech, but with a conversation. Nothing formal, the organizer had said over the phone. Just share what it felt like and what you think we need to do now. At first, she wasn't sure how to answer that, because what it felt like wasn't clean or digestible. It was messy, contradictory, exhausting. But eventually she'd agreed, not because she had the answers, but because she was tired of people filling in her silence with their own assumptions. She stood backstage for a few minutes before her name was called, eyes fixed on the floor beneath her feet, trying to keep her breath low and even. Her father was somewhere in the back row, arms crossed gently, watching without hovering. Trina was up front, next to a group of retired teachers who'd shown up with notebooks and pens ready to take notes like it was a seminar. She could hear someone tapping their nails against a clipboard. She could hear a child's laugh echoing off the side wall. And somewhere in that soundscape she found enough stillness to step forward when they called her name. The stage wasn't high, but it felt elevated in a different way, like she was being held up not by a platform but by attention. Real, undivided attention. She sat on a simple wooden chair, legs crossed at the ankle mic, in one hand the other, resting lightly on her knee. She looked out into the crowd and saw not a sea of faces but individuals, people who had come to hear, not just to be seen there. She took a breath, then began. "I've told this story a few times now," she said, "in interviews, in court, in small rooms, in big ones. And the hardest part is always the same. It's not the moment itself. It's explaining how fast it happened, how something changes your whole life in the space of a few breaths." She didn't raise her voice. She didn't modulate it for effect. She just let it sit in the air line by line, like steps down a long hallway. "I didn't know what to do," she continued, "because I thought I was doing everything right. And I didn't understand until that grip tightened around my throat that sometimes the right thing doesn't matter to people who've already made up their mind about you." There were no interruptions, no murmurs, just a room full of people leaning forward, ever so slightly absorbing each word, like a slow drip of truth they hadn't realized they needed. And after it was over, after the videos and the courtrooms and the headlines, she said what I kept asking myself was, how many people were there that day? How many saw it start and didn't stop it? How many had seen things like that before? And I said, "That's not my business." Her voice didn't rise, but it reached further. "I don't blame them. I really don't. But I think about them. I think about how silence doesn't always sound like guilt. Sometimes it sounds like fear, or exhaustion, or habit. But no matter what, it costs something. And that cost doesn't fall on the people who stay quiet. It falls on the people who are already carrying the weight." She stopped there, not for effect, but because she needed a breath, not just to speak, but to feel the room. "I'm not here to tell you how to fix the system," she said after a pause. "I'm here to tell you what it feels like when it breaks over you. And what I hope more than anything is that the next time you see something bending the wrong way, you don't wait for it to snap." When she finished, there was no applause at first, just quiet. Deep, thoughtful, settled quiet. The kind that doesn't ask for performance, only presence. Then someone stood, then another, and then came the sound, not of cheers or noise, but of feet, shifting chairs, scooting back, people rising to their feet because they understood something had just been said that needed space to land. Savannah looked down for a second, let the moment wash over her, then rose from the chair and walked slowly off the stage. She didn't wave, she didn't bow. She just returned to her seat near the side of the room, sat beside her aunt, and let the feeling of something new beginning settle quietly around her like a coat she hadn't realized she'd earned. And in that moment, with no script, no spotlight, and nothing but her story laid bare, Savannah Keene did the one thing they'd tried to take from her. She changed the room. Savannah didn't plan to speak again that week. She'd already done the interview, the committee meeting, the town forum. She had already stood under too many lights, answered too many carefully worded questions from people who wanted to appear concerned without risking discomfort. But the invitation to the high school arrived on a Tuesday evening, tucked inside an email from a guidance counselor named Miss Ortiz, who simply wrote, "They've seen the footage, they've heard the noise. What they haven't heard is your voice up close, unfiltered. You'd be doing more than speaking. You'd be showing them how to stand." She stared at that message for several minutes, rereading it, not because she needed to, but because something about the tone struck her. It wasn't press, it wasn't politics, it was personal. And when something is personal, you lean in. So she agreed, not because she wanted to relive the moment, but because there were students now asking questions she never had the freedom to ask at their age. Questions about safety, identity, justice, and silence. Questions that came out in whispered hallway conversations and group texts sent late at night with shaking thumb. That Friday, she arrived at the school just after noon, slipping in through the back lot where buses idled in a slow, diesel-scented haze. The building was the same one she'd visited as a freshman for a regional debate competition. Low brick-wide windows, and that strange blend of adolescent chaos and institutional stillness only schools managed to carry. A student volunteer met her at the office, nervously pushing up his glasses as he led her down the corridor. "Thank you for coming," he said softly, as if afraid of saying too much. She smiled, nodded, and asked for his name. "Miles," he said. "I'm in 11th. Everyone's nervous to meet you." Savannah didn't answer right away. Instead, she glanced at the lockers lining the hallway, stickers, scuff marks, forgotten posters curling at the edges. "You don't need to be nervous," she said finally. "I'm just someone who told the truth out loud." The auditorium was already half full when she stepped onto the stage, the kind of murmuring room that holds more anticipation than noise. She took her seat on the small stool in the center, beneath a single spotlight that made her skin glow warm against the backdrop of navy curtains. No one introduced her. No grand build-up, just silence as the room slowly quieted, and dozens of students, some holding notebooks, others gripping their phones, turned to listen. She didn't begin with what happened in the courthouse. She didn't talk about the grip around her throat, or the courtroom verdict, or even her father's name. She started instead with a question. "How many of you," she asked, "have ever been looked at like you didn't belong somewhere? You had every right to be." Hands didn't shoot up. They rose slowly, uncertainly, like secrets slipping from behind rib cages. Eyes darted across rows, shoulders stiffened, and she nodded, as if that answer in itself was already enough to begin. "I used to think doing the right thing would keep me safe," she continued, her voice level measured without theatrics. "I thought if I followed instructions, spoke calmly, didn't challenge anyone, I'd be protected. But what I've learned is that safety isn't something you earn by being polite. Sometimes it's denied before you even speak." She let that settle. No one moved. "But the most dangerous lie we're told," she said after a pause, "is that we have to stay silent about it." Someone sniffled near the second row. A phone buzzed, silenced quickly. "When he grabbed me," she continued, "I didn't scream. I didn't fight. I said 5 words. Call my father. Right now." And in those 5 words, I reclaimed myself not because of who my father is, but because I remembered who I am. Because I refused to let someone rewrite the story of who I was becoming. She looked out across the crowd then, not scanning but seeing, and she saw them seeing her back. Not as a symbol, not as a trending name, but as a young woman who had walked through fire and come back speaking in full sentences. "You have a voice," she said quietly. "And you don't need a podium to use it." There was a stillness in the room that felt holy, not because of reverence, but because it was rare. Rare for teenagers to sit with their feelings unmasked. Rare for a speaker to trust them with the raw edges of her story. The Q&A that followed wasn't structured. It wasn't rehearsed. Hands rose slowly at first, then faster, with questions that weren't really questions at all. What do you do when the people who are supposed to protect you are the ones who hurt you? What if nobody believes your side of the story? How do you not get bitter? She answered each one with the honesty of someone still figuring it out. You ask for help even if your voice shakes. You document everything. You breathe before you speak so your words come from power, not pain. And finally, you don't try to be unbitter. You try to be whole. When it ended, they didn't applaud right away. They stood. Not because someone told them to, but because they needed to, because something in them understood that standing was an answer in itself. As she exited through the wings, Miles was waiting again, arms crossed but eyes wide. "I think you changed something today," he said softly. Savannah smiled, placed a hand briefly on his shoulder and said, "Number, I just named something that was already there." Outside, the sun had begun to sink low behind the roofline, casting a soft glow across the parking lot where rows of cars and bikes waited in patient silence. Savannah paused by her own car, looking back once, not at the building but at the doorway, where students still lingered, as if stepping back into the world now required a different kind of courage. And in that moment she felt something unexpected, not burden, not exhaustion, but a quiet release, as if some unspoken weight had lifted, not because the work was over, but because it had finally begun in someone else. The house was quiet, not the kind of quiet that begged for music or conversation, but the kind that allowed things to settle like dust or memory or breath. Savannah sat at the kitchen table alone, the late evening sun filtering through the half-closed blinds, casting narrow gold stripes across her forearms and the wood-grain surface. The mug in front of her was half full, still warm, untouched since she'd poured it. A pen rested on the edge of a notebook, uncapped, the tip dried slightly from waiting too long between thoughts. She wasn't trying to write anything profound, just a few lines she'd promised herself she'd get down before the moment slipped too far away. Something simple, something true. It had been weeks since the ruling days, since the town hall hours, since the student forum, and somehow, even with all of it behind her, the world still felt like it hadn't finished shifting. Not dramatically, not loudly, but slowly, like a wheel turning just enough for the light to fall in a different place. She'd come home that night, not exhausted, but emptied in a different way, like a well that had been drawn from over and was finally starting to echo at the bottom. She leaned back in her chair, one foot tapping softly against the tile, her gaze fixed on the stillness outside. The streetlight had just blinked on, casting a dull yellow cone on the sidewalk, and for a moment she watched a moth dance through it, frantic and delicate, spiraling towards something it mistook for warmth. There was something about that movement, erratic yet intentional, that felt achingly familiar. Like every time she had spoken her truth into a space and watched people react, not always with understanding, but with noise, with heat. Her father was upstairs, the floorboards creaking gently as he moved across the room, probably reading over an email, probably pausing to replay a message from one of his colleagues now, following Savannah's story with newfound interest. They didn't talk much about what came next, not because there wasn't more to do, but because for the first time in a long time, there wasn't pressure to do it all at once. The storm had passed, and now came the rebuilding. Across the table, her phone vibrated, a quiet, short buzz against the wood. A message from Trina: proud of you. You changed more than you realize. Savannah read it once, then locked the screen and turned it face down. Pride was something she was still learning how to hold. It didn't feel like triumph. It felt like responsibility, like being handed a torch when your arms were already tired, but you still found a way to carry it forward. She closed the notebook, gently stood, and walked slowly through the living room toward the back door. The air outside was cooler now, soft and full of the scent of damp grass and pine. She stepped onto the porch barefoot, her toes curling slightly at the chill of the wood, and leaned against the railing. The stars had begun to appear, faint at first, but certain. And somewhere in the distance, a dog barked once, then fell silent again. The neighborhood was calm, porch lights, flickering wind chimes, tinkling faintly from a few doors down a curtain, shifting as someone peeked out to check the weather, or maybe just the world. Savannah exhaled slowly, her breath visible in the cold, and let herself feel it. Not the event, not the attention, but the after. The part no one prepares you for, where the headlines fade, and the adrenaline settles, and the only thing left is the weight of what it all meant. She didn't regret speaking, not once, but she had learned something through the process, something deeper than outrage, more enduring than applause. She had learned that justice doesn't feel like fireworks. It feels like silence, finally making space for truth. It feels like being able to sit in your own home, in your own skin, and not shrink. As she stood there, arms folded against the breeze, she remembered a moment from childhood, her father teaching her how to balance on a wooden beam in the backyard, one foot carefully in front of the other, arms stretched for balance. She had fallen the first 3 times, scraped her knee the 4th, and on the 5th she'd made it across. He didn't cheer, he didn't lift her in triumph. He just nodded and said, "Now you know you can." And maybe that was what this moment was too. Not a victory but a crossing, not an end but a knowing. She turned back toward the house, the windows glowing warm behind her, and felt something settle deep inside, something quiet, steady, unshakable. Not peace exactly, but presence, the kind that says, "I am still here. I am still whole. I am still mine." And with that, Savannah stepped inside, closed the door behind her, and let the night wrap around her like a truth finally spoken and no longer questioned. In life, there are moments that happen in just a few seconds, yet their echoes stay with us for a lifetime. Savannah's story reminds us that sometimes all it takes is one courageous act, a single sentence spoken at the right time, one steady, unflinching look to change the way others see us, and more importantly, how we see ourselves. For those of us in our senior years, perhaps we've witnessed injustice, or stayed silent, believing no one would listen. But silence held for too long becomes a burden. The lesson here isn't in the noise of the crowd, it's in the quiet strength of one person who dares to say, "I am here. I deserve respect." Even at 60, 70, or beyond, we still have the chance to stand for what's right, to listen with kindness, and to remind our children and grandchildren that dignity isn't something we have to fight for, it's something we must never forget. If this story made you pause, made you reflect, or touched something deep in your heart, please hit like to help share this message with others. And don't forget to subscribe to join us for more real stories, gentle, steady, but powerful. Because sometimes one well-told story is all it takes to change the way we see the world. Thank you for listening.